1, 2, 3, 4. I got thoughts running through my head. I got thoughts, can't you see? I got thoughts, the books I read. I got thoughts, won't you listen to me?
I think one of the ways I can actually illustrate what I believe on with Rorschach is to contrast him with the character of Nite Owl, Dan Dreiberg, in the Watchmen series. Now, I've always liked Nite Owl. I love the costume and all that, and even in that time when I was reading it as a teenager, I wanted to see more of him. I love the gadgets. I love that costume. I love that whole motif, and I wanted to see more of it. And I often find that writers fall in love with a character, especially characters that may not be that good a character as far as a protagonist that you can empathize with, believe in, as in they might get more enamored of Rorschach because he's a more interesting character study, and in some sense neglect Dan Dreiberg's Nite Owl because he's kind of the goody two-shoes guy. And Dreiberg, as I've read him as an older man, he's kind of the lifelong nerd, and maybe that's what I liked about him, is that he didn't necessarily get the girl until he did with Silk Spectre. But he was, very smart. Everything he did was based off of his things he invented or his intelligence, and then, he made himself able to fight. And when he couldn't, when he needed help, he made these gadgets and all that. So he's kind of, that escapist nerd fantasy type of archetype. And as I've looked at him as an older man now, I can see some of the things that Alan Moore was trying to say about him, is that he's a great big old man child. He's clearly stunted. His growth is clearly stunted, psychologically speaking. And Alan Moore has spoken about superheroes and all that, and he has said that he thought Watchmen would hopefully be the last superhero story ever told, because it exposed the silliness of superheroes escapist fantasy. That basically it is the fantasy of smelly man children who wanted wish fulfillment and wanted to be able to control a world that clearly they can't. I don't disagree with him. Superheroes are a silly escapist fantasy, but that's okay. That's where I differ with Alan Moore, is that I think it's fine to write escapist literature, to like escapist literature. I am a stunted man child of my own, but this was kind of his deconstruction of that forever young man child, that Peter Pan trickster kind of character, even though Dreiberg wasn't really a trickster, but that escapist fantasy character. He shows Dreiberg get the girl with Silk Spectre, but if you read it, there's a lot of subtleties in there where Laurie, Silk Spectre, goes with him, but you can always, as soon as John comes in, as soon as Dr. Manhattan comes in, she fucks off with him, and he's just, Dan Dreiberg's left holding his dick almost. Even in the television series that just came out, Dreiberg's nowhere to be found. He's been captured by the Vigilante Task Force, and he's actually being used as a bargaining chip to make Laurie, Silk Spectre character, who's now an FBI agent, played by Jean Smart, to do this mission that she doesn't want to do. It's funny to contrast, to see how other fans and writers and such look at that Dan Dreiberg character as just not interesting, not something interesting to write. And I've struggled with that in my own writing, in that in the Bridge Chronicles, it's not meant to be where there's good guys and bad guys. I mean, the protagonist, Bridge, is not a good guy, and I've made many pains to say he's not a good guy. This is a guy who participated in the cover-up of 30,000 people disappearing. This is a guy who has often done not just morally questionable things, but just outright wrong things, or facilitated wrong things to happen. And he's not a good guy. And honestly, the good guys in the book, people like Stonewall Ricardo and the gang members of the Five Families and all that, they're protagonists. But again, they're gang members. They're killers. They're certainly not people you'd want to invite to your block party, unless you happen to live on that block. They're not your typical people that you'd want in your neighborhood necessarily. And I think really in Bridge Chronicles, probably the only character I could say is a good guy would be Aristotle. And even he's got a track record he's been in prison. Of course, of the books, he has killed people, but he's probably the closest thing to a good guy. So I've struggled with that of trying to write good stories and interesting stories. But I've also, in one of my short stories, did a short story about a character specifically to try to make a good guy character, a guy who has the morally questionable choices ahead of him, and it would be easier to take those choices, but he takes the harder path because he doesn't feel right about the morally questionable part. And I'll talk about that more when I do the video on the short story compilation. But in a few of my stories and a few of my characters, I've tried to make it so that I write some characters that are good guys, that are the not action movie type characters, the characters who would not be the hero of an action movie, but are people that probably should be lauded. They should be, these are good guys. But back to Watchmen and Dan Dreiberg, he seems to me like that kind of character. It was kind of a good guy, nice guys finish last type of character, but also a statement on the fandom and what they like in their escapist fantasies. Dan Dreiberg, Nite Owl, Silk Spectre, Dr. Manhattan, and Ozymandias, all four of them have participated in some way in 3 million people getting killed in the blink of an eye. So that's not heroic. Now, of course, the whole point of it was that the whole point of what they were doing and covering it up was this is to save billions, to stop nuclear war. But and it's not made clear whether Alan Moore actually, I don't believe he actually thought, hey, Ozymandias' plan is terrible, but it was a good idea. It's not. I don't think he believes that. I don't know. I've never seen him really speak about that. But in the end of the Watchmen TV show, at the end of the season, and I'm assuming there's only one season, they haven't announced a second one. One of the things I think it kind of fell down on was that it felt like it had to punish Ozymandias for that act, the act of fooling the planet with this alien creature in order to stop a nuclear war. They felt like they had to capture him and put him out and show, hey, this is bad. And it's funny that one of the people who was going to make him do that was Gene Smart's character, who helped him for 30 years. So, a little bit disingenuous there. And I felt it was kind of too Hollywood an ending in that respect. And I don't want to dissuade you from watching the show, but I think because I think it is a good show. I just think that is an interesting change. Now, one thing I wanted to talk about with Watchmen before I signed off on this was some of the ancillary books or some of the other pieces. One of the things I love Watchmen as a book. The original 12-issue miniseries was absolutely fantastic. It's not perfect. I think the whole Tales of the Black Freighter side story, he did a little too much of the literary device where characters reading something and it says one thing and then you kind of see a corollary of that in different characters doing things in the regular panel. I think the Tales from the Black Freighter stuff was an interesting sidebar, but I don't really think it necessarily, after a while it just got tedious. It just wasn't, it wasn't all that interesting. I think, when you take it to the movie and you pull that stuff out of there, I don't think the story suffered any for it not being in there. I know some people, Zack Snyder especially, were adamant about it, said it's very important, but it's really not. It's kind of just a metaphor on the world and how the world is different from the world we're in, where we have escapist fiction based on superheroes. It's not bad writing, but it's just, I think it just gets tedious after a little while. The Watchmen isn't perfect. There are some flaws, but the artwork is fantastic, and if you've never read Watchmen as a series, you really should. It is, in my opinion, required reading for anybody who likes comic books. If you like superhero stories, Marvel movies and that sort of thing, I think it's a really good read to the really good deconstruction of the superhero myth. I don't think it should, like Alan Moore thought, I don't believe it should diminish your enjoyment of superhero movies or books or comics or whatever, because again, I think they kind of mythological modern day myth, escapist fantasy. And I think we need that. I think it's entertaining, and I think there's still some interesting things that can be said using that medium. Before Watchmen was a series in, I believe, 2015 that DC put out, and you can go read online. I probably have some links to the basically the fight between DC Comics and Alan Moore about sequels and merchandising and ancillary stuff with Watchmen. Alan Moore really did not want any kind of sequels. He wanted creative control, and supposedly he was one of the things DC said is that when Watchmen went out of print, he could have the rights. It just never went out of print, and DC made sure of it. And so DC has retained these copyrights, and Alan Moore has basically refused to work with DC because of it for 30 years. And I don't disagree with him on that, because I think he probably was screwed. He probably was told one thing, and then DC did everything in their power to make sure they didn't have to follow through on that. But, so Alan Moore didn't want sequels. He never was coming back to write one. Dave Gibbons has been fine with it. Dave Gibbons was the artist who also co-created it, did a lot of the costume design and things like that, and the fantastic artwork. Dave Gibbons has been fine. He was actually involved with the TV show, and I believe he was involved with the movie as well. So he's been fine with it. That's fine. I don't owe either man any animosity for how they feel about their work. But Before Watchmen was a series of miniseries. I want to say there's like 8 of them that DC put out in 2015 by various creators. Many of them very well regarded. I mean, J. Michael Straczynski wrote a few. The guy who did Babylon 5. Darwin Cook wrote, I think, 1 or 2 and drew 1. There's good creators on most all of them. Lynn Wein actually did write a series as well, and I've read them all but the Crimson Corsair one, because I just don't care about that. I think that's part of the Black Freighter stuff. Just don't care. And again, they're not bad, but the biggest problem I had with them was how unnecessary they were. And prequels can a lot of times be unnecessary. And a lot of these were all mostly, they weren't really all prequels, but they were just different facets. A lot of them were before the Watchmen series started. Some of them kind of expounded on things afterwards, like the Dr. Manhattan book. So, it's not that they were bad, they just weren't necessary. Watchmen is such a really fantastically self-contained story that as much as you might like the characters and want to find out more about the characters, you really don't need to. You know all you need to know about them. I didn't need to see more of the comedian in Vietnam. Didn't need to see it. That's all I needed to see. I didn't need to see anything about him with JFK or Robert Kennedy. Any of that. The Rorschach story was one that was... It seemed to have no place, because in the comic we saw the case that really turned Rorschach from what he said was a pretender to the crazy killer he ended up being. We didn't need to see this other story, which wasn't really... It lacked any kind of impact, because we already knew that the case that pushed him over the edge was later, and This one, he got a little more violent, but it was just part of an escalation. It wasn't really that interesting. The only one I say that was interesting is actually the Minutemen one, because in the comics we didn't really see a lot of the Minutemen stuff. It was just basically flashbacks and all that. In this actually talks about the beginning to the end of the Minutemen. I will say that the Before Watchmen, which is supposedly in continuity, is completely invalidated by the Watchmen TV series, which is also supposed to be in continuity, because Hooded Justice in the Before comics was supposedly some German white guy, whereas Hooded Justice in the comics is black, or in the TV show is black. So where they stand in continuity, I'm not sure it matters, because again, you can read Watchmen, the 12-issue series, completely as a standalone and need nothing else. Absolutely nothing else. Now, the Watchmen movie that Zack Snyder did, like almost 10 years ago, I guess, I like that movie. I need to watch it again. I haven't seen it in a few years. I liked it. It changed the ending. It took away the alien beast and made them put everything on, on Dr. Manhattan. And I didn't have a problem with the ending then. I still don't really have a problem with it now. It's as a self-contained thing. I think it was fine. It was that ending change was fine. Although I did miss the big tentacle creature in the building image. I thought that was a cool image. It had some of Zack Snyder's more annoying features, the slow-mo fighting and all that. But it was the movie, 300 was the movie that got him on the map. Watchmen was the one that kept him forward and probably ended up getting him the Man of Steel job. Some of his worst aspects, it was his subjectivism and that sort of thing, is pared back a little bit. And his tone fits Watchmen better than, say, Superman. So again, I think it's fine as a movie. It's one of those you could watch it by itself and never read the comic, and I still think you'd be better off reading the comic, but it's not too bad. Read the Watchmen, forget the prequel books, and watch the TV show if you are so inclined, or if you're not. So next week, or whenever the next video is, we'll hopefully be talking about If Tribe Equals, and from New Year's Day or New Year's Eve, I tell you, Happy New Year. I hope 2020 is better than 2019 was, because 2019 can go suck a bag of dicks. And I will see you next time.
I got thoughts running through my head. I got thoughts, can't you see? I got thoughts, books I read. I got thoughts, won't you listen to me?
Fear the pug of darkness.